Angry protesters, ardent sympathizers, and ugly confrontations mark the immigration crisis as it arrives here from Texas. A new law offers parole to a middle-aged man who was 17 when he gunned down a San Diego police officer. The police chief and DA are opposed to his release. And is the impossible railroad still impossible? Lawmakers demand answers about a lucrative railroad lease that could be illegal. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome. It's Friday, July 11th. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Chris Genuine, editor of the Times of San Diego, Tony Perry, San Diego bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times, and reporter Dorian Hargrove of the San Diego Reader. The arrival in recent weeks of thousands of Central American immigrants, many of them children, overwhelmed authorities at the border in Texas. The crisis spilled west to San Diego last week as immigrants flown here for processing were met by angry protesters at a federal facility in Murrieta. Chris, this volatile story has a lot of moving parts. Let's start with what's going on. How many folks have gotten here, and what's going on with the flights right now?
Well, the flights were canceled effective Thursday, and the federal authorities will not say when or if they will resume. There were 3 flights, don't know the exact number on each flight, but we're talking about less than 500 people now being held at the Border Patrol facility in San Ysidro, and some, under the law, may already have been moved to foster family or temporary care facilities elsewhere.
But they're here for a while. These folks get processed, and then they get a court date and the backlog. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then they're in the community someplace.
They are. This is all due to a 2008 law that was designed to combat sex trafficking. And the idea was that if you're a child unaccompanied who comes across the border, you are at risk to be brought into a sex ring or to become a criminal, so we have to deal with you as a government. So the law requires that these kids are put up by the federal government, that a foster family is found, and that there is a court date before they are deported if there isn't a reason for them to stay here.
Mm-hmm. But not an attorney. They don't need to get appointed an attorney as you would if you were indigent and charged with a crime, say, in state court.
No, it's all handled through the federal government. In fact, there's a 5-step process that is on the Department of Homeland Security website, and it's a lengthy process. And that's the reason why why all of this is taking so long right now.
So what's the assessment of how this confrontation unfolded up there in Murrieta? How were these protesters able to come up and turn these buses around?
Well, you know, it started well in advance of the actual flight into Lindbergh from Texas. The Riverside Press Enterprise quoted an official of the union representing the Border Patrol officers saying that the facility in Murrieta just wasn't big enough to handle an influx. So that news was out there several days before. You know, Murrieta it's not a small town. It's 105,000 people.
Yeah, about an hour north of here, South Riverside County.
An hour north of here, just north of Temecula. But it's a town that has been out of that is not in the national limelight. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone was surprised. The mayor, Alan Long, was on national television. He talked about compassion. He suggested the protesters were from outside of Murrieta. They were not local. I would say that it certainly was not an unexpected protest, but I wouldn't say it was spontaneous either.
Mm-hmm. So some planning involved.
But I think we can say that it was not some of the best police work we'd ever seen, that the police could not or would not or had no training in how to keep protesters from blocking a street. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much, lesson 1 on how to deal with crowds. By day 2, they had learned it, but that first day they didn't, and suddenly it was national news.
Kind of a line of observers there.
If they had moved them off, as they did ultimately, the buses would have went through, and it would not have been huge national news.
It was an embarrassment in many ways. I mean, that's exactly what Assembly Speaker Toni Atkins called it. She said it was shameful for California. The second day, or the second protest, they used the little-known California lynching law to arrest some of the protesters. And one thing to keep in mind: the numbers are very small. 140 people. It's a very small number compared to even the population of Murrieta, which is 105,000 people.
And small in terms of the overall numbers coming across the border. Doria?
Does anyone know what spawned them coming, what spurned them coming? Were they getting away from something? Because they're younger, obviously, right? And what were they?
There's been a big increase in the immigration on the part of unaccompanied minors. Looks like it'll be 90,000 in the fiscal year ending September 30th. That's 3 times the level the year before. What's driving it is poverty and crime in Central America. Honduras, according to the United Nations, has the highest murder rate in the world. El Salvador and Guatemala are in the top 10. And what's happening is smugglers are telling parents, I can get your kid to America, I can get you out of this. So. And then we get them, and under the 2008 law, we can't take a child that's swimming the Rio Grande, immediately put her on an airplane and send her back to Honduras. We have to go through a complicated legal procedure.
One of my colleagues, Brian Bennett, out of our Washington Bureau, what he did on his reporting is he said that what we have in Honduras and Guatemala, the smugglers have found sort of an opening based on American law, American culture, and they've created a market for themselves, and they make money off of it. That's a pretty tough viewpoint, but Brian had reported it out. So it's all across the board on just why these folks are here and what do we do with them. Any of us who have lived in San Diego for any period of time have seen one iteration or another of the illegal immigration issue, and it is just an agony. It is usually unsolvable at a local level, and the federal government can or won't do anything about it.
Well, federal leaders have certainly been battling one another. President Obama's opponents have come out. He's lashed back. Was there anything at all about the executive decision in 2007, the Dreamer Act or action as it's known, that has anything to do with this, as some Republicans are claiming?
That legislation has an impact, but only when it's filtered through the smugglers in Central America. Basically, if you arrived in this country after June 15th, 2007, you cannot be processed under this act. So it doesn't apply to the ones currently coming in. In fact, Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson sent out an op-ed, which we published today, that basically is an open letter to the parents in Central America saying, don't send your kids because they're not eligible for, as he put it, permits, permisos, letters of residency. You're not going to get it. You're going to be deported. Of course, it's going to take it a long time.
Now, what about Darrell Issa, of course, one of the great vocal critics, the Republican congressman from this area? What's he been saying and suggesting the president do about this?
Earlier, it was last week, he drafted a letter that was signed by 32 of his colleagues in Congress that asked the president to publicly state that the current arrivals will be deported, that they will not get amnesty or any kind of special dispensation. He also asked for a change in that 2008 law. But the fact of the matter is, if you're living in a poverty-stricken place like Honduras or El Salvador, are you going to hear a public message? Are you going to be watching TV? Will you be reading a newspaper, let alone being online?
Well, we did talk with Congresswoman Susan Davis, of course, a Democrat, and let's see what she had to say about the surge of immigrant children.
Well, I think while we have those children, again, we have a law that tells us that we have to do that. And so until that changes, and I'm not exactly sure how it can change, we have to send a very, very strong message to the traffickers, to the smugglers, to the people who are encouraging parents to do this, that they can't expect that that's going to happen. But we also know that this is a time that some parents are feeling that they have been told they have this window. And if a parent feels that that is their last hope for their child's future, parents do these things.
So it sounds like she's sympathetic, but not really saying asylum, permanent asylum. It gets back to your point about it being a thorny issue.
And what we see and hear out of our locals, I think, is they want to take the right position and then move on. That they have a sense, I think, correct, that it's an insolvable problem, certainly on a local level, or one or two Congress people. So the conservatives like Issa say something tough. The liberals say something sympathetic. Or Davis, sort of in the middle. She has a little bit of for both sides, and then we move on. Not a lot of Congress people want to grab onto this issue and become associated with it. Same concept that the President of the United States doesn't seem to want to go to the border in Texas, be photographed at the border, and then become the issue.
It's one of those issues, a bit of a nasty comparison, but it's trying to pick up the turd by the clean end, as they used to say.
Or I've got a cleaner version. It's the leaf blower effect. My goodness, can I just get this issue over somewhere else? Yep. Blow those leaves into the neighbor's yard.
And move on to
And in
something
California,
else.
Murrieta seems to have achieved that in an odd sort of way.
Yeah.
I don't know if the Border Patrol is ever going to send any more plane loads back. They may not.
All right. Well, we're going to have to move this issue on to another one and get on to our next segment. I'm sure we'll have much more to say as we move along. Well, even the killer admits it was a vicious, cold-blooded crime. Police officer Archie Buggs was conducting a routine traffic stop when he was shot 3 times in the chest and once in the head on a San Diego street. Now, 36 years after the shocking and senseless shooting, the killer is up for parole. Tony, let's begin with the facts of this case. Tell us about Officer Buggs, first of all.
Archie Buggs, 30 years old, Army veteran of Vietnam, African-American, grew up in San Diego, wanted to be a San Diego cop to pay back to his community, is doing a night shift in the Skyline area, stops a car, bad taillight or speeding, and as he is writing a ticket for having an open can of beer in the car, one of the occupants of the car is handed a gun by the other occupant of the car, and he pumps 3 of them into Buggs's chest. Buggs falls. He walks over to him, puts one right in his head to make sure, gets in his car, speeds off, is arrested several hours later. This is, he's 17 years old at the time. Jesus Cecina, his compatriot, his co-defendant, if you will, was 20. As a 17-year-old, he is now in prison on a life sentence, although he's still up. He can still go out on parole. Earlier this year, a new bill became law, and it allows for an easier road to parole for individuals sent to prison for long periods of time for things they did when they were under 18. He has served nearly 35 years now, and he's eligible. And so he... And a board, and we'll get into this more in a moment, but a board has said they've looked at the whole case, and they say you are eligible, especially under this new law. He'd had a dozen parole hearings under the old system, right, and he'd been turned down. At some of them, he came up with stories that didn't really pass the truthfulness test about how the killing happened. I was shooting in self-defense. Well, that didn't fly, and other things. In recent years, he'd come closer to admitting what he did and taking responsibility for it. And under this new law, if you did something under age 18, you get a greater plus marks for the fact that you were young, and also greater plus marks for rehabilitation. He has shown some rehabilitation, considerable rehabilitation during his years in the state prison system. He's no longer in a gang. He mentors young prisoners. He's in Alcoholics Anonymous and some other things. Got married, did he not? Got married, no conjugal visits, but he got married in 2008. He's in prison. So middle age, quite a different place in his life than at 17, and that's what the law is designed to do. Indeed, he has a very, very good attorney. She represented him at his last parole hearing 2 years ago, and it was clear then that the head of the parole board hearing said, you better do this, this, and this if you want to get a chance at getting out. Now, he did this, this, and this, and then along comes this new law. So in April, at another hearing, they recommend to the governor that he be paroled. It will hit the governor's desk in a couple of days, actually, and he'll have 30 days to make a decision. He can say yes, he can say no, or he can do nothing, and that's the same as yes. Now, if he says no, it can still go to the courts. You can always appeal to the courts. I wanted to open it up. Not surprisingly, as Tony Story pointed out, the DA, the police chief, current cops who knew the deceased back when, they're all against this. What do you think of that? Well, one concern we have in California is the rising prison population. And with 3 strikes, you're out. This is a challenge for the state. And maybe this is the opening of a way to deal with this long-term prison population. Indeed, the state is under great pressure. And this new law, SB 260, calls for these hearings very quickly. It's very much a conveyor belt. Now, the district attorney, the chief of police, Police Officers Association, a lot of individual, mostly retired cops say he is still a danger. he still will not admit the horror of what he did. He will admit, yes, I came out of the car firing. I shouldn't have done it. It was awful. What he will not admit to, or what he will not give a recitation to, is that final shot, walking over, looking right down at a cop dying, or maybe even dead already, and putting one in his head. That's why Bonnie DeMonis and Deputy District Attorney Rick Sachs, who went to the parole hearing, say he is still a danger. He will not admit what he really did, and they've sent letters to the governor. We'll see how well that does.
And Archie Buggs was one of the good guys. He was one of the first African-American officers on the force. He wanted to work in the community, give back to that community.
Did a lot of, he stopped a lot of cars at night looking for stolen cars. He'd been warned that can be dangerous. It was in a different era. San Diego was a different place. San Diego Police Department was a different place. They didn't give them bullet-resistant vests. They didn't give them shotguns. The radios were so-so.
Didn't really think we had this horrible gang situation here?
We still hadn't come to grips with the fact that this is a big city and we have gang problems. Cecina was a member of a street gang, and that we have a drug problem. The city, I think, when we were both much younger,
right,
and at the San Diego Union, the officialdom still hadn't really accepted that. But after the death of Archie Buggs, according to Jerry Sanders, who was a beat cop then and is, chief mayor, now CEO of the chamber, things changed. That period, 75 through 85, San Diego was coming of age, plus and minus. This was an enormous minus. And in the years that followed, they issued shotguns, they issued vests. One-officer cars is still the standard. Occasionally, when they can, when there's an issue, they will send 2 officers in a car. But this being San Diego, we like to keep things, inexpensive, so we really don't have enough cops to do that all the time. And after Buggs was, and that's still true, but after Buggs was killed, the police officers, and there was a new chief named Bill Collender at that time, stood up on their hind legs and made a lot of noise that we need 2-officer cars, we need better officer protection. It was in an era when beat cops didn't stand up very well to the chief. They did in this occasion, and it really changed the department and the city.
Now, quickly, before we move on to the next segment, what happens if this guy does get out? Does he have a place, a job?
He's been offered a number of places. A number of do-gooder groups have offered him things, one in Los Angeles. He may come back here. He has a brother who has a business up in East County. Brother's offered him a job. He's got a bunch of offers. Now, he would be on parole. He would still be, in theory, watched over, but we know how thin that is. Mm-hmm. But he has said, he has made his apologies and says he wants to live a life dedicated to showing his remorse for what he did. DA, police chief, cops, not buying it.
All right. Well, we'll see what the governor does with that one, and I'm sure we'll follow up with that story. Well, it's known as the Impossible Railroad, a track built nearly a century ago through steep, twisting gorges. It was supposed to be a railway lifeline to the east, spurring great commerce in the San Diego region by connecting our natural harbor to the rest of the country. Hasn't worked out that way. And Dorian, as you reported this week, it certainly has not worked out at all. There's critics now, including U.S. Congressman, about this current deal. So let's start there. Who owns this railway? And give us a little overview of what it is and what they're supposed to be doing with it.
Okay, well, the railway was originally built in, well, it started in 1909, and by John Spreckels. And basically it's part of the trolley system now. So it went from downtown San Diego to Tijuana, then kind of bypassing the most rugged areas of San Diego County and coming up through Division into Campo and then into Imperial Valley. And over the years, the trolley took over, and then you have the Mexico portion. So they all got split up. So MTS really owns, it's only a 70-mile portion from Division to Plaster City. And it's that portion that, it has tunnels, it has dangerous, terrain, and it just hasn't been able to get off the ground ever since this new ownership took over, which actually has been better part of 6 years. They're just operating under a new name now. Mm-hmm.
Now, they're as you reported, they acquired it, they had major plans for it, and it's a 99-year lease. Give us the high points of that deal.
Well, so they have certain milestones in place, but it's $1 million a year, 2 payments of $500,000, and in it, the MTS says that you have to have certain improvements. You have to show, or the people at Pacific Imperial Railroad have to show that, you know, this track is coming along, that it's going to be closer to start taking, you know, moving freight from Tijuana, from the factories in Tijuana up to the east, and you know, a lot of people are excited because basically it's bypassing that whole route of going into LA and then trains coming back down to San
across
Diego.
The border and that big bottleneck there. So I mean, it was an exciting thing.
But
Chris?
isn't the business community particularly interested in seeing this line be rebuilt? I think the South County Economic Development Council counts it one of its top 3 projects.
You know, and I've heard so many different things. Actually, when there was freight moving from 2002 to 2007, before this group took over and these people took over, it was mostly just sand. I mean, you still have, you know, the harsh reality of that terrain there, and winds and everything else, and a lot of the rails actually can't support, you know, only a certain amount of weight and freight. So, I mean, you know, a lot of people are praising this as maybe that big next thing for the region. The reality is that's going to take a lot. I mean, even the factories, the maquiladoras, don't have, you know, lines right to that line. And Toyota, which was touted as one of the potential customers, also don't have a way to get, you know, cars to this, and the train couldn't even take, you know, so many cars.
So
go ahead,
what
Tony.
is our next pinch point? Is there a deadline? Is there a congressional hearing, a lawsuit? What's the next pinch
due, right?
Yeah, so the payment was due July 1st, and
that was $500,000.
That was $500,000. It wasn't made. The people at Pacific Imperial Railroad are
saying...
And
that's a payment to MTS, we should be clear, as part of the lease, yeah.
And the people at Pacific Imperial Railroad are saying that because of this letter sent by Congressman Hunter and Denham, that they want to hold off on the lease, the payment, just to make sure that this is, you know, that it's legal, the lease between them and MTS, and make sure that this money isn't going to go, you know, be paid mistakenly.
Who are these people? Are they people with a track record, or are these dreamers who would like to own a railroad?
You know, track record is a nice way of putting it, actually. You know, these people have had over 120 lawsuits all combined.
Oh, good.
Dozens
against them, obviously.
Against them, yes. I'm sorry. You know, in various ways of, you know, they might have filed cross complaints and everything else, but. So they've had dozens and dozens of lawsuits just in San Diego County alone. I mean, you have Gina Seau suing one of them for $2.5 million, saying that they ripped, you know, that basically took her money for this railroad and spent it.
Junior's widow.
Exactly.
So investors are very upset, and that's what these congressmen are raising some of these issues.
Because,
this is a company with a checkered past.
Yeah, and you know, if you look at it, a lot of these players, Charles McAfee and Dwight Jory, and a lot of these players that are now in major positions in this railroad company, were part of the Carrizo Gorge Railway after it got taken over. So in 2008, there was a change of ownership. Shareholders did this coup where they voted out the original people in Carrizo Gorge, and they took over. From that point to to present, there's been no freight that's ever moved on there. So it's either...
You noted just tumbleweeds are moving along.
Yeah, and you know, and I spoke to someone who said, you know, it's either just great incompetence or something else is going on. You know, no one's really sure about what the motive is, because all you have is you have no proof of anything happening there.
Mm-hmm. And the upfront money is public money? Is there public money up front here?
Well, they're raising money to pay MTS, which would be public money.
Okay.
And MTS says that they would, you know, make it go towards improvements and everything else. So for MTS, they're thinking they're in a great position, because they're getting $1 million a year if that were to happen, and you know, this line's going to get used. But then again,
nothing was happening beforehand. Yeah.
Exactly.
It was a liability simply before that.
And these people aren't, you know, I mean, it takes a simple Google search, and you start seeing, you know, lawsuits of accusations of fraud, allegations of fraud. I mean, it's not a very difficult thing to find out, you know, about these players, and MTS obviously didn't mind, or maybe don't go on the internet.
And your story pointed out there's some folks who were officials with this new railway company who have left, and now they're saying, hey, there's some skimming here, there's some Peter robbing Paul and going to places in Nevada.
Well, and you know, in some of these employees, there is a president, David Rohall, who came in from Jacksonville, had worked in railroads for decades, came in to serve as the president, and him and his brother put over, I think, $1.25 million combined into this investment. I mean, they're really looking at the investment, and they start seeing it disappear. they start seeing payments being made to other companies in Nevada, which all of these players, Charles McAfee, Donald Stockline, Dwight Jory, are all from Nevada, Las Vegas. So you start seeing these mysterious payments, and you don't know where they're coming from.
We got a few seconds left. The MTS then is just going to watch and see what happens with this lease as we go forward?
Yeah, and now they're saying they're giving it until the 14th. They have a meeting on the 15th. The agenda was posted just today. We don't know, if that's going to include discussion or not, but they have until the 14th as of now.
Okay, and on that meeting, I mean, you'll do some follow-up reporting, I imagine.
We want you there.
I will be there.
And we may see something definitive as that plays forward. Huh?
Yeah. And like I said, I spoke to some people who weren't even sure the agenda was going to be posted, if maybe the meeting was going to be, adjourned or what.
Well, you stay on it on our behalf.
I will, thank you.
Great. All right, that wraps up another week of stories on the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Chris Genuine of the Times of San Diego, Tony Perry of the Los Angeles Times, and Dorian Hargrove of the San Diego Reader. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.